Hello, welcome to another episode of On the Waterfront, sponsored by Waterfront Logistics. I'm Weston LaBar, and I'm here today with Jonathan Rosenthal, who has a fantastic background. He's the founder and managing partner of Saybrook Capital, amongst many other things. But he's going to join us today to talk about AI, investments he's made in the AI space, and his experience in implementing AI into logistics in the broader sense, and then more close to home, the supply chain and logistics of supply chain. And so, Jonathan, you have a very fascinating background, helping reorganize large asset-based logistics companies like airlines. The same with industrial companies in gas and oil and other, again, asset-heavy enterprises that they rely on logistics. More commonly, we look at logistics as a supply chain function when it's really something much larger than that. Can you talk a little bit about, to start off, who you are, your background in logistics, and how you've adapted that into your more recent forays into supply chain and supply chain
Well,
technology?
Weston, we've known each other a long time, and I really appreciate you, allowing me to join and talk to your guests. Uh, so you're right that my journey has been, kind of interesting. I'd like to say that it was intentional, but that's not how life goes, right? It happens the way it happens. Um, uh, I started off in the logistics business as an entrepreneur in aircraft logistics. So I built a company back in the 80s that was a precursor to a company called NetJets. It was called Net Air International. And it was the first and ultimately the largest on demand corporate aircraft national company with 18 flight centers and a couple of hundred airplanes and things like that. I took that public in '85 and sold my stock in 1989, and but it really got the bug for logistics. And you're right. You say that we generally think of logistics as supply chain, and I don't. Right? I think of logistics as the movement of assets within any network, and so that's the science of logistics is applicable across a lot of things. And frankly, I didn't know much about supply chain until around 2011, 2012. But after selling the airplane company, and I tell you that about the airplane company because I don't come at this as a financial engineer. I didn't go to business school. I never took an accounting class. I'm not really a finance guy. I'm really an operator who started out with nothing. Uh, but that journey took me into a bunch of different areas, and ultimately into supply chain. But before there was a couple of stops along the way where I was hired by the federal court in a number of instances to take what I characterized as logistics businesses because they had assets that moved within networks that were broken and going into bankruptcy. And I was hired by the court to figure out how do you fix them, what's wrong, why is it broken, how do you fix them, what caused the problem, in particular. So I did that. I think I did about 25 reorganizations of bankrupt businesses. But along the way, was really blessed to have some incredible brands that I was allowed to to participate in and lead in terms of the reorganization. So probably the first was Pacific Gas and Electric, which I looked at as a logistics company. It moves assets, it moves electrons, it moves gas, and the goal in a logistics environment, logistics science environment, the goal is to move as many assets as you can, regardless of what that asset is, as efficiently as you can. Try to find those friction points, those points of impedance or systemic friction, and then figure out like, okay, how do we relieve that? How do we make the flow better? So uh, increase utilization of the what I think of as servient infrastructure, right? there's a lot of in a trucking context, that's servient infrastructure or things like roads and other stuff. But the point is, how do we move the inventory? Right, the inventory is the hosted asset. We happen to have lots of infrastructure designed to move those hosted assets. Same thing with Pacific Gas. We were very inefficient. It caused a bankruptcy. There were a lot of reasons for it. It took 3 years to reorganize that business. It turned out that when we stepped back and said, "What's really the problem? What's really going on here?" And that helped us a lot in solving the problem. And it ultimately was the largest and most successful reorganization in history. It was the highest return for creditors ever. We returned 108% of their money. 108%. And that's
Wow.
of unsecured debt. So, and by the way, the shares went from $6. We had 400 million shares outstanding, and it went from something like 620 a share to 28.40 on 400 million shares. So that's about $8 billion of additional value. So we kind of we were able to unlock tremendous amounts of value. Now we did that through a whole bunch of stuff. We were pulling a lot of levers. We didn't really understand, frankly, what those levers were doing as well as we could have or should have. But ultimately, it kind of worked. And then right after that, I got hired to do the same thing, same role by the court in United Airlines. And United Airlines was near and dear to my heart because it was in the airplane business. And my mentor, a guy named E.B. Jepson, uh, was was a United Airlines pilot in 1930, and so I felt a special kinship and a real passion to help that situation. Um, it was really interesting. It was really stressful. We were When I got there, which was the day after they filed. I got to Oak Grove, Illinois, on a snowy afternoon. Uh, they had 170 days of cash. They were burning $2 million a day. Um, and we were in deep trouble. We were in deep trouble. And fortunately, everyone, usually you kind of fight with the other side. You fight with the board. You fight with, you know, I represented $28.5 billion of unsecured claims, and so you end up everybody's got their thing. In this case, I think everyone was committed to saving 225,000 jobs and a 100-year-old company. And so we worked pretty collaboratively together with the others. What I learned there, again, it was a logistics company. What did they do? They had an asset. What was the asset? It was a seat. That's how you measure an airline. It was a seat. And the question was, is there somebody's butt in that seat when you close the door, right? Uh, and we actually measured productivity by how many seat miles are being flown and how many seat miles have someone's rear end in that seat. It's as simple as that, right? When I got there, the what's called ASMs, available seat miles, and utilization of available seat miles was about 71%. So about 29% of the seat miles were empty. And you remember this, Weston. You remember, when you get on an airplane, after deregulation, you get on an airplane and you'd say, shit, I sure hope I get an aisle seat and I don't have some big fat guy sitting in the center seat, right? So you're always looking for that center seat. You remember this? So, okay, okay,
Uh, all too well. I also remember being in the center seat with two
yeah.
fat guys
Well,
on both
that's much
sides of
more
me on
likely
early
today.
airplane
That's much
flights. That
more
was
likely today.
never fun.
So, we pretty quickly figured out at United um, that the one thing that airlines have, uh, they don't have good food. But one thing they have that's really good is they have fantastic data, unbelievable data, and they have fantastic information systems across the industry. Now that's not because they're so smart. That's because of the way the system was designed. And it was designed that way because in the early days, and even in the 80s and 90s, you'd pick up a phone, you'd call a travel agent, and you'd say, "Hey, I'm going from LA to Chicago next Tuesday." And in a matter of 5 minutes, that travel agent had to be able to say, "Well, there's a Delta flight, and it's this much, and there's a American flight, and here's a TWA flight, and blah blah blah. And by the way, you want a hotel, and you want a rental car, and okay, so you just crossed 10 different software operating systems because every one of those nodes, rental cars, hotel, all that stuff, has its own bespoke, customized system, right? But in the airline business, we had something called Sabre and Apollo, which was a standardization of all those systems so that you could look across the system. Those systems they were interoperative, and you could do analytics. You could do predictive analytics, right? Not just what we think of as prescriptive, that is what's happening right now, but you could actually do predictive analytics. When we figured that out, we were able to use that information to fill that empty seat. Because before that, Weston, it was industry standard knowledge accepted by everybody that um, that you had mismatched city pairs. And the reason that happens is because everybody flies from LA to New York on a Monday morning. They all want to come back on Friday, and the airplane has to come back on Monday afternoon. So it comes back Monday afternoon, half empty. So we figured out that matrix, and it really drove home to me the value of information and the value of analytics and data. We saved that airline. And by the way, every other airline, Delta, Northwest, Continental, you name it, they all followed suit. They all followed the United game plan.
Well, and that's a really great segue into your experience in supply chain, and then what you're doing today. So, we got first introduced when you bought TTSI through Saybrook. To my knowledge, that was your first foray into supply chain. You made other investments in other areas of supply chain, like 3PLs, like tailored services and others. But you built a nice portfolio of what would be known as really strong operators in the industry who are then acquired by others because of that those capabilities, the strong customer relationships, the efficiency. And what you're describing in airline is very similar to what we see in transportation side of supply chain logistics, which is idle assets. You don't want trucks sitting around because you have to pay for that, especially in a post AB5 economy in California, where you're an true asset based operator. But the other thing is empty miles, right? You don't want to be in a situation where a truck is deadheading from some place where you've hauled a load one place and you're coming back empty. And everybody always tries to solve that through commercial settings, but really there is a smarter way to do this. And if you want to speak a little bit about your experience and let people know, but you've used all that information that you've and that experience to launch ESP, which is akin to the Palantir of the commercial sector, as you've called it. And so, talk a little bit about your experience on the supply chain side of it, and then coming out of it with successful exits. What motivated you to get into the geospatial sort of data intelligence game of supply chain? Because many companies, and some are kicking and screaming, but they're being forced by their customers to evolve and to innovate, or to be left
Yeah,
behind for
yeah,
those who will.
great question. I shared the United story because it was really central to how we got where we are, which is kind of came out of United and said, wow, uh, that worked out. That was big. And how can we take what we learned, which is, boy, this the key to all of this is data. The key to all of this is information and analytics. Um, uh, Gee, I wonder where else in logistics we could apply this, um, that where there's a dearth, there's a real absence of analytics and a real absence of information and a system that isn't interoperative. In other words, there's real impediments. I mean, I've always said, show me a really well run business, I'll show you a place I can't make any money. Um, so uh, so it became, I really knew very little about supply chain. We had never owned a traditional supply chain company before. Um, but with that in hand, we said let's look at supply chain, and in particular, let's look at the drayage business because it looks like a really inefficient business. A lot of wasted assets, as you've said, a lot of guys waiting at the gate for 3 hours to get in, and dwell times of an hour, hour and a half, and there's lots of reasons for it. And then on top of that, what do their information systems look like? Well, they're really not like the airlines. They're very good, oftentimes, but only with respect to that particular entity. So, to the extent somebody has a warehouse management system, great inside the box, right? Uh, Somebody like Manhattan, fantastic system, very granular, very sophisticated inside the four walls of the box. Or a trinium being used for a trucking operation, very good, very granular for that business. But the minute you take a network perspective, the minute you step back 30,000 feet and say, well, wait a second, I'm a BCO and I really need to understand, like, where's all my inventory, not just right now, but where's it going to be? What are the potential problems so that I need predictive analytics so that I can anticipate and mitigate those problems. So when we looked at the supply chain, we said, wow, this looks like a very ripe place to take the things that we learn about information and begin to apply them. And that was a pretty good bet. So we made a small investment. We invested in TTSI. Um, I think it's probably common knowledge. It's been reported. I think we invested about $19 million of equity, and we bought TTSI. We were very fortunate with TTSI to have a fantastic management team headed by Bill Allen and Vic LaRosa. Many of Vic passed away, but really great managers, great partners. It wasn't easy. We built that business up. We made a bunch of acquisitions. We rolled that business up, and we sold it to another private equity firm for a little bit more than 150, 160 million bucks. So it was a winner. But we applied a lot of those same principles about
Yep.
information, uh, about efficiencies, about trying to find those points of friction and eliminating them. But this problem that you raised about ESP and the technology, how did we get there? Uh, it really stems from something that I was asked to help with by the Department of Commerce back after the Hanjin bankruptcy. I don't know if you remember the Hanjin bankruptcy. I had been saying, yeah, I had been
All too
saying to
well.
the feds, guys, I think the systems, the supply chain, global supply chains, are incredibly fragile. Hanjin went bankrupt. We all saw what happened. The system sort of melted down. People started hoarding chassis. Terminals started closing. I mean, it was really kind of a nightmare, right? For 6, 7, 8 weeks, and all of a sudden the feds kind of raised their hand and said, "Hey, I know you've been saying it's kind of a fragile system. Boy, we're seeing it in real time. What do we do? How can we make the system more resilient?" And so we brought together a bunch of people in Washington every quarter for better part of 3 or 4 years, trying to figure that out. And it didn't take us long to figure out that this problem of the non-interoperative systems and the lack of data standards was really at the core of the problem. And now I think it's generally accepted that these disparate systems need to sort of come together. And so you see companies like, P44 or Four Kites, something like that, um, trying to integrate, trying to give you what people call visibility. Uh, and that's certainly better than we had, right? Uh, you, what's visibility? I mean, visibility is where's my shit, right? That's visibility. But I've said from the outset, uh, providing visibility is important. It's table stakes, but that is not uh, a solution. Um, because when a customer calls you and says, "Where's my stuff?" it's too late. That customer is yelling at you and saying, "Where's my stuff?" And the reason he's calling is because it's not where it's supposed to be. So I always picture a guy standing on the dock, waiting for his container with his phone in his hand, calling up
Where's
calling up his
where's my
trucking company and
stuff?
goes, "Where the hell's my stuff? It's supposed to be here." And the guy says, "Well, I don't know where it is." Okay, so that's visibility. But the fact is that so I call that the point of disruption. When that customer calls you, his system or her system is disrupted. And so that's
And COVID was the true inflection point because for the first time, everybody was dealing with the lack of
right.
predictability in the supply chain. And so visibility became such a big buzz term because everybody expected things to be late or in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they wanted to be able to have, it was always the adage you go to all these conferences like TPM, which is coming up. People talk about their Domino's pizza app and knowing when they're putting on the pepperoni and when it goes in the box and when it shows up. But in actuality, nobody wants to watch that. Nobody wants to have to look at that. But during COVID, it seemed like the best solution available. What we've gone to now, and this is what I'm so interested in hearing about, is it's from visibility to that predictability and agility within that supply chain. People want resiliency and what they want predictability. And how do you do that? Because I'm going to tee you up here. The last 10 years has been, I think, some of the fastest innovation, believe it or not, in supply chain that we've ever seen. And you have this system of systems that is asset heavy. You have ships, you have trains, you have trucks, you have facilities, but the intelligence behind them were not connected. And over the last 10 years, just to summarize, you started with we don't have the data to we don't have good data to well, we have some good data, but a lot of bad data to inconsistent data. We don't have integrations. My point is a lot of those things have, for lack of better words, been solved for, right? Data's better. There's more of it. You just have to know what you want to use it for. It's easier to integrate. You're not seeing as many proprietarily built systems that don't have any ability to integrate outside of the four walls, as you talked about. You're getting to more of the cloud-based computing, API, open API integrations. But what do we do with it, right? Because that's really what we need to get to. Here at Waterfront, we use ESP as our brain, right? We're using ESP to collect all the information and the data from our systems and pair it with other information that's out there to try to have a much more predictable model in logistics moving forward. But ultimately, it also gives us the ability to insert narrow AI and generate the data necessary to get to what everybody thinks of, which is predictable scenario planning. What's the butterfly effect? And that's where I think that the industry's going. But you've kind of got that already here today. And I think that's what's so interesting because you saw the deficiencies with TTSI. Still ran a great company, but saw where it could be better. And now you really took advantage of the black swan event, COVID, to roll this out and do different things. So how would you have liked to apply this, and how have you applied this in your transportation and supply chain companies? Because my guess is if you bought TTSI today versus when you did, you would have a lot of different things, knowing what you know now, that you have used as tools to make it just that much more efficient and given you that much more of a market competitiveness to the shippers of the world that actually don't care where their product is. They want it to show
Yeah,
up and show
yeah.
up on time.
All of that I think is right, and I think a big epiphany for us was this notion that um, sort of the old world, uh, let's call it pre-AI. The old world was a system of relational databases, basically. A TMS, a WMS are giant Excel spreadsheets with a fancy front end, right? And so that's kind of how we looked at, we used to look at the world was through, and that's a great way to figure out, how many blue shirts do I have in the warehouse. Um, but there's another way, and we learned this through one of our partners called Esri about geospatial intelligence. AI accelerates innovation dramatically because it flattens the learning curve. The learning curve is I make something or I do something, I try it out, I learn, I innovate, and I do version two. Okay, that's the standard learning curve, oftentimes called Wright's law. Um, that's gone because now with AI, we can actually do simulated learning. We can simulate very quickly what a system looks like, what a network looks like, where do I really need my warehouses? Where do I really need, how many trucks do I really need? When should they be dispatched? What's the optimal routing? All of that stuff can be simulated, and so there's a flattening of that learning curve, an acceleration of innovation. Uh, and so if you agree with that, I mean, if you agree that AI is definitely going to accelerate innovation, I think it's hard to disagree with. Um, then you have to ask yourself, um, are we an organization that is designed to meet that challenge? Can we adapt rapidly enough? Are we willing to adapt rapidly enough? And I think that takes some real soul searching. Uh, the companies that I've been involved with, like United and Pat Gas, they're very large, very asset heavy. Uh, they had two big problems. That supply chain companies often suffer, which is they had tons of embedded infrastructure, so they were invested. They couldn't just leave that infrastructure, right? They couldn't just abandon what they had invested in, whether it's existing technology systems or having the right trucks in the right places, having the right warehouses, et cetera. They can't just abandon that. By the same token, they have to make changes to adapt to this change in the rate of innovation. So what do you do? And I think you've really got to do some soul searching as an organization. Are we willing to make decisions more rapidly, reduce bureaucracy, because that is the way of the world? And I maintain that, if you don't do that and you don't embrace information and intelligence tools, and you don't embrace AI, which is an enormously powerful tool for predictive analytics, um, you're going to die. I mean, I hate to say it, but you're sort of a dead man walking, right? Because there will be folks that are good at it, that know how to deploy it. Uh, it's nothing to be afraid of. It's enormously powerful, and we don't need to debate whether it'll do good things or bad things. I'm sort of on the good, on the it's going to do good things. It's going to do bad things, but I'm going to let somebody else worry about that because I have no, that's not my gig. I like to build companies, so I'm not going to worry about evil doers. Um, but ESP is really that. ESP is something that it's a technology that we've spent 20 million bucks building with a bunch of with a number of partners, that's fully deployed, and that is providing that sort of driving out inefficiencies, finding the inefficiencies, being able to even visualize those inefficiencies, uh, and then figuring out workflows that eliminate those inefficiencies, right?
The way I look at it is, I've often called the supply chain a blind relay race, right? And look at a cargo as the baton that gets passed along. And the way it's typically been is somebody's running with a blindfold, and they hope that the other person is where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be there to hand it off. But they really can't see that, and they don't know that. But more often than not, that person's standing there. And what you're trying to do with ESP is remove the blindfold, first of all. And maybe removing the blindfold was the visibility portion that we have. But now it's more of you've removed the blindfold and you're using the brain to say that person's not in the right place at the right time. But I see somebody else right next to them that I can hand this baton to, and let's let them take it up because I'm no longer confined with the systems and the partnerships that I currently have. Now you're allowing it to be a more organic process where you're looking at all the data points in front of you and saying, my guy's not there, so I'm going to hand it to this person and let them run with the baton because that's the way that we keep things moving. I think, and I want to get into the op-ed you wrote for the Wall Street Journal because I think it really deals with this, and then what the two big issues are, right, in the adoption of AI, and this is the next industrial revolution. It is going to massively, enhance and change the way that industries work, no differently than the supply chain, or I mean the assembly line did 100 years ago, right? These are just things that continue to make things better and more efficient. But in supply chain, you've got two big issues, and let me know if you disagree. One is that you've got companies that are purpose built for inefficiency because they make money when things are inefficient and when there's capacity constraints. And the fact of the matter is that everybody makes more. The rates are higher in the supply chain when there's capacity crunches and things are inefficient. So you look at something like the railroad. It's they have no competition. They compete with one another. There's five, really, 4 to 5 major class one railroads and all these short lines. But if you look at during the pandemic, Norfolk Southern was probably one of the most lauded railroads for all the enhancements and efficiencies they tried to create to add more capacity. And their CEO was then fired by his investors and board of directors because he didn't maximize the profit abilities he would have had. The job of something like a railroad is monolithic. Don't disrupt what we have going for us because it's a good thing. And then in other instances, and you see this you probably saw this at companies like TTSI and others, is you've talked in the past about legacy think, like I've invested in this, so I have to use it, or it's always been done this way, so it needs to continue to be done that way. It'll never be done this other way. And you have people, especially with AI, that are fearful that it will replace them. And I shared with you, I took an MIT course that was all about how you use AI to make people's jobs easier, how to make them more efficient. But most people look at AI as this boogeyman that's going to replace them. And so you've got two challenges with making things better, more transparent, more efficient, which is companies that have been designed to make money off just the opposite, and people who are fearful of the unknown. And they've watched maybe one too many science fiction movies that say, if you have AI implemented, your job's gone. And to talk why there's that misnomer, because your op-ed addresses many of these different things in a nuanced fashion, but how AI actually is a way to help people, and it's a help to maximize efficiency and profits. And we shouldn't look at the way things were done yesterday as a detractor for how things
Yeah,
can be done
I think
tomorrow.
those are insights. So take them one at a time here. Uh, so you're right. We all made lots of money. During COVID because congestion charges and all kinds of surcharges. So we did really well. I think a lot of us did pretty well. Um, but now your customer can see that and can simulate what happens, and they have the ability with tools like ESP to really find where those inefficiencies exist. And I don't think they're going to tolerate it, right? I don't think the customer is going to tolerate it. It's going to be much more visible to them, and it's going to be much more, sort of front and center. So uh, I think those days are gone. I mean, we certainly saw it with the shipping lines, where they were making, 25, billion dollars in profits when, Maersk, I think previously reported $5 billion. So, containers were $20,000 rather than 1,800. So we saw that. I mean, geez, a pretty good deal, but you own the ship. That didn't cost any more. The gas was the same. You had the same labor. What the heck? What's with it?
You just
Yeah, you
charge
charge.
more for what you're
So,
already doing.
the great American way, I guess. So no crying over spilled milk. But I think there's the tools that are available to the beneficial cargo owner today are just so much more powerful, that they can squeeze so much out of the supply chain sort of cost. I just don't think that you can, as a vendor, as a trucking company or 3PL, I don't think you can stick your head in the sand. I think you need to say, no, we're gonna leverage this technology, um, to make ourselves better, to produce a better product, a better service, for the customer. However, that's it, whether it's faster or cheaper or more responsive to their needs. I think things are going to get better. You raise the issue about job loss. That's of course a big thing. And I don't know, frankly, where I come out on net job loss. Uh, I don't. I've listened to all the experts. Lots of opinions about that. Historically, we know that technology actually drives more jobs, not less. But I think AI is a different animal. It really takes a different. It's not like going from, hey, we used to use shovels in the field, and now we have tractors, and that's going to kill the job for the guys with shovels. Yeah, but it created a lot of jobs, that we didn't expect. I don't think you can just stop there. I think there will be a change in the jobs. The kinds of so many things will change. There will be new jobs for sure. Whether there's a net loss or not, jury's sort of out.
And just quickly on that, I'm more of the school of thought that the jobs will be different. That it's really a workforce training question, less of a will there be jobs. It's more of do we have the right people to take the jobs that will be created versus the people that would take the jobs that we currently have that will be eliminated, right? And so it's about alignment between what's needed versus what we currently have. And that's where the education system, our workforce training programs, the government needs to make sure that they're hearing where the jobs of the future are going to be and investing in our education and workforce training programs to make sure that we actually have the right synergies because there's always jobs available. I mean, look, we have relative unemployment based off of what the numbers that are reported are, but there's still so many companies that have a hard time finding workers to fit their needs. And the workers that need jobs aren't the ones that qualify for the jobs that are available. That's fundamentally what needs to be solved for. And that's a difficult conversation. So that's kind of where I line
Yeah,
up.
well,
Just I
look,
think we're in the same
it's a
boat.
fair debate, right? And I don't think any of us can know for sure. We don't have a crystal ball. Where does it end up? Is there a net job loss? Do we have to adjust things, somehow through a 30-hour work week or God only knows what? Who knows, right? The one thing I think we would agree on, both those schools of thought would agree on, is that AI is here to stay. Uh, it's not going anywhere.
Mhm.
It's too powerful to just bury your head in the sand and say, well, we're gonna put in regulations that say you can't use it. Well, if we can't use it, you can be sure there are other countries that will use it and will have a tough time competing. So I think it's here to stay. And so you really do have to, as a leader of a company, you really have to understand it. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's incredibly powerful and interesting, and I use it for all sorts of stuff. Uh, but that's the way you begin to understand how it might affect your business. Is you get in there and you ask it questions and you learn about it. Now, I think that what will happen ultimately, that today we're in the first 10 minutes of a 9 inning game, um, and I think, and where we are today is you have generalists, AI generalists like ChatGPT 5 or Gemini, these are generalist AIs, right? They know a lot about a lot of different things, but they have no subject matter expertise until you put it in, right? So, uh, so,
Mm.
but what will happen, I believe, is that we will develop a community, and it could be thousands of AIs that are specialists. There will be a logistics savant, and that logistics savant will know everything there is to know about logistics. There'll be maybe even sub savants in trucking or in drayage, even or LTL. Um, and that savant, because it's been queried by so many people about issues related to their particular expertise, it will become very, very smart with respect to that particular expertise. And those savants will begin to collaborate with one another. So it might be a trucking savant that collaborates with a warehouse savant, and they'll do that automatically. Now, the thing that really surprises me a bit when I talk to our investors and I talk to others about how this is going to impact logistics, um, they don't really appreciate that this industry, logistics and supply chain industry, is very, very susceptible to the use of AI. You really need two things. You need enormous data pools, data lakes of good information, and we're getting better at that, particularly as we put more and more devices on containers and pallets, and
Mhm.
and we're collecting better and better information. We're trying to.
And computer vision's a big part of it too.
Yeah,
The OCRs that are happening at ports and warehouses and terminals. That's all just consuming data to be
that's right.
utilized for
That's
some
right.
other
So,
application.
so we're slowly but surely creating these enormous data lakes, and they have a lot of accurate information. It's no longer a guy sitting with a clipboard or fat fingers on an iPad, right? So we're collecting more and more information, and that's what you need. That is the feedstock for the AI on the one hand. On the other hand, you have hundreds of thousands, probably millions of decisions within the global supply chains that need to be made. And many of those decisions can be assisted by automation, um, by suggestions like, okay, you've got 30 different things you could do. You could use, this routing, or, you could use this, you could truck it and you could ship it, you could rail it, but, here's all the data points. What's my best solution? So it begins to give you recommendations. You need a human in the loop, for sure. You need a human in the loop that at the end of the day can decide, is this the right recommendation or not? But it's certainly it shortcuts a lot, and gets you to a much better decision, much more quickly. And that's what ESP is designed to do. That's exactly why we designed it. And we didn't mention that it's fundamentally different because we learned about this thing called location intelligence. And location intelligence is an entirely different way to organize information that really allows you to look across a complete network and do analytics across a complete network of nodes. So um,
As opposed to the ledger process that
that's right.
most people are
That's right.
familiar
I mean, the
with.
way to think about supply chain, or the way I think about supply chain, is it's really like a neural net. It's like a neural network, right? You got all these nerves in your body, um, and they're sensors, right? You touch a hot stove, and it communicates to your brain and says, "Oh, wait, I shouldn't do that. I need to." And it communicates to your muscle and says, "Pull away from that." Right? Um, that's a hot stove. I got to do something. So it's a neural net. The problem today is that these inputs of it's a hot stove feed up to what? There's no brain. There's no brain that can take all of that input and say, oh, this is what I need to do, right? I need to pull my arm away because I just touched a hot stove. So that's the intelligence platform, and that's what what we've done with what we've done with ESP is to try to create an intelligence platform, which we had to design around a geospatial uh, architecture. And listen, we won't be the only ones.
Yeah, this has been like a really great conversation about a topic that we could go on forever on. I'd like to finish up with one last quick question, which is, again, if you went back and you bought TTSI today, with where the industry's at today, so these legacy companies that are trying to figure out what should they be doing to continue to be around and not be another footnote as to the bankruptcies that so many companies have experienced. What are the top three or so things that you would do if you bought a legacy company today in the AI era to future proof it, to make sure that it's still around? Understanding all the things that you did buying a company like TTSI and getting it to a successful exit. If you had the tools today, what would you do differently day one until, let's say, day zero?
Um, that's another good question. So you've got to change first and foremost. You've got to change culture. You've got to, unfortunately, get rid of people that you believe are legacy thinkers who will not change the way they look at things. If they're not willing to learn, if they're not willing to innovate, if they're not willing to take risk, um, uh, there's not much you can do. This is a brave new world, uh, and so the first thing I would do, and we've purchased many companies across many industries, and so you've really got to look at your team, particularly the leadership. You've really got to look at your leadership team and say, are we willing to think differently? Are we willing to step back and say, this is a brave new world? It's a very exciting world, and we can really be a leader if we understand the opportunity. So that's kind of the first thing. Without that, you're just the headwind is too great. So that's the first thing I would do. Um, and build a great management team. Underneath that, uh, I think the second thing I would do is with TTSI. I think we were too slow to grow and integrate. It took us 8 or 9 years. I mean, we looking back, we could have done that more rapidly. We would have been, we would have been bigger. We would have the technology would have allowed us to scale much more rapidly. There's a huge opportunity, as you know. I mean, within the drayage and trucking business generally, there's, it's a very fragmented business. Part of the reason it's fragmented is those information systems. I think the BCOs would support scale, and so that's the second thing I would do. And I think the third thing I would do is I would spend a lot of time with my customers. You know, uh, and they are every single one of them, no matter who they are, they're trying to figure out how is AI going to make my business better or threaten my business. They don't know. They don't know. None of us
Mhm.
know, right? And because it's too early. And so it's very interesting. I'm sort of embedded in this AI ecosystem of lots of people talking, on podcasts and all kinds of stuff, and writing op-eds, about AI. And the whole conversation in the AI ecosphere, if you listen to it, is about chips, infrastructure, data centers. How are we going to get the energy? It's all about that, right? There's very little conversation about how do we transform businesses? How do we use this technology to transform business? How will the business transform, right? And so uh, your customers, you can be sure, your customers are thinking about that at the highest levels. So in that C-suite, they're thinking about whether it's Walmart or it's a small jean manufacturer. Uh, uh, they're thinking about how are we going to be disrupted? How can we use this technology? And so I would be talking a lot to my customers. What are they thinking about? How can we help them? Uh, those I think are the three things off the top of my head.
And what a great exclamation point to a conversation, because let's be honest, if you're in the supply chain, you're really trying to evolve into what your customers want from their daily convenient suppliers. I mean, the Amazon effect, e-commerce. What really defined COVID was people were not getting what they wanted as quickly as they were used to getting it. Right, the overnight Amazon effect had dried up, but the expectation was still there. And when you are looking at what you're doing as a vendor in the supply chain to a BCO, it's really driven by they don't want to lose their customer because they can't get it to you when you want it, or it's more expensive than the competition down the street. And there's going to be a continuous drive to provide things faster, more conveniently, and more inexpensively than the day prior. And for the companies that are successful, that's what they've been able to do. And Amazon, Walmart, Target, they've all been able to meet the customer's demands where they're at a cost point that the customer's willing to spend. And they've put others out of business that are unwilling or have not been able to do that. And that's really what we've been charged with in the supply chain is, can I make my customer's customer happy? And if I can do that, then I'm going to have a business. If I can't do that, they're going to find somebody
And
who can.
yeah, I think that's right. And I guess the question for the vendor, whether it's warehouse business or 3PL or drayage business or whatever, is should I be reactive to my customer or should I be proactive? And here's our goal: more efficiency, whatever, lower prices, less waste, whatever it is. This is what we're kind of shooting for. But we wanted to share that with you because we know that you're trying to figure out a much bigger picture, and we know that you're wrestling with with the same issues except at a much bigger scale. And we want to be part of that conversation, and we want to be your trusted advisor on our niche, on our little piece of the world. We want to tell you what we're thinking about and how we think we can use this technology, what we're deploying in order to make your life better as a customer. And I think customers are going to appreciate that because they're looking for solutions. They do not have solutions today. I mean, maybe Amazon has a team of 500 people thinking about this, but um, uh, most companies do not have a solution to this. Everybody's scratching their heads.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us today. I mean, this is, we like discussing AI. I'm sure this won't be the last time we have a conversation. Really happy to introduce the audience to ESP and some of the tools that are emerging in the industry as solutions that should be embraced to be part of tomorrow's supply chain. But Jonathan, thank you for joining so much. We'll continue this ever important conversation on AI and how it impacts logistics. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy
Well, it's
schedule to
great,
join us
Weston.
here
I've
today.
always enjoyed talking to you. It always gets me charged up and enthusiastic. And I think we're all trying to, we're all trying to make money, but we're all trying to, make the world a little bit better place too. And I think we have a big opportunity to do that in supply chain working if we work together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining. That's Jonathan Rosenthal with Saybrook Capital here for another episode of On the Waterfront, sponsored by Waterfront Logistics. Until next time, we'll see you on the waterfront. I'm Weston LaBar. Have a great day.